Is it? What a creature design.
I managed to hit record just as you said, what a creature design. Love it.
Oh, good.
Hello, and welcome to Movie Night with Andy and Gabe. I'm Andy.
And I'm Gabe.
After World War II, Japan was occupied by America from 1945 to 1952. The Cold War is on, and despite being the only victims of nuclear war, Japanese waters were a testing ground for further nuclear weapons. On March 1st, 1954, a tuna fishing boat named the Lucky Dragon No. 5 set out to Bikini Atoll to fish. While they were out there, they saw what very few people have ever survived seeing: a full nuclear explosion. Not just a run-of-the-mill nuclear explosion either. They saw Castle Bravo, the largest nuclear explosion ever carried out by the United States, and the fifth largest of all time. This wasn't an atomic bomb like what was used on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. This was a hydrogen bomb, which was far more powerful. Despite what we think of today, at the time, atomic bombs didn't have as high a fatality as the fire bombings of World War II, but this was something different. Radioactive dust and debris smothered their boat, and the crew as a result suffered acute radiation syndrome. 7 months later, the boat's chief radio man, Kubayama Aikichi, would die due to complications of his sickness. He'd be considered the first casualty of the H-bomb. The incident tanked the fishing industry in Japan because the public feared eating contaminated fish, and the incident put a huge strain on the diplomatic relationship between the US and Japan, with the Japanese considering it to be the third time America had hurt the Japanese with nuclear weapons. The United States government paid $2 million to the crew of the Lucky Dragon 5, but they denied responsibility for the incident. Conspiracy theories from the Japanese accused the US of intentionally experimenting on the crew with the bomb, because while there was a warning zone that boats were not allowed to travel through, the Lucky Dragon wasn't sailing in that zone. They were outside of it, where they were allowed to be, and they were still hit with the fallout because the bomb was 3 times more powerful than they had expected it to be. So this was 1954, and Japan was no longer under occupation. During occupation, Japan's media was under heavy censorship, and art criticising or depicting America, the war, or showing Japanese military was not allowed. This was about to change. Producer Tomoyuki Tanaka was flying over Bikini Atoll after a meeting, and as he looked down, he thought about the Lucky Dragon 5 incident currently in the news, and he thought about making a monster movie from it. He hired legendary director Ishiro Honda and special effects artist Eiji Tsuburaya, as well as Japanese acting royalty Takashi Shimura, and production on Godzilla began. The Japanese didn't really know the truth about nuclear bombs until after occupation had ended, and they were finally seeing the keloids from radiation in the news. There were movies about the bombings, and then finally Godzilla shows them something no one has ever seen before: Tokyo in ruin. It's horrifying because it doesn't show what has happened, it shows what could be. The movie was very controversial on release, but ultimately went on to be acclaimed as one of the best and most important Japanese films ever made, being nominated for the Japanese equivalent to the Oscar alongside Seven Samurai. Godzilla showed destruction of radiation. It showed the military. It broke every censorship rule that Japan was under just 2 years prior. And now, Gabe has seen Godzilla for the first time. What was your experience with it?
Wow. Well, boy. See, now I'm sort of reeling from processing all that information that you just gave me. I had no idea. I had no idea that that was what happened. Or I had no idea that that incident with the fishing boat happened, or that that's what spawned the idea for Godzilla. And I had no idea that we were continuing to test nuclear weapons in and around Japan after we had done that. You think about the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, especially if you're like me and my country was responsible for it, and you think, wow, that couldn't possibly have been worse, and it apparently was. Um, Boy, that's depressing. Godzilla. So, man, fuck. Sorry, that your intro there kind of threw me. God Almighty. Um, okay, my experience with Godzilla as a media property from the time I was an infant until yesterday was, for whatever reason, in the 80s and 90s, writers thought that having a racist stereotype of a Japanese man with a camera around his neck pointing to something and saying it's Godzilla when the thing he's pointing at is not Godzilla was the funniest fucking thing that could ever exist in a script. And I saw multiple iterations of a racist Japanese stereotype pointing at something and saying it's Godzilla growing up. And that's about all the contact I ever had with Godzilla, I'm sorry to say. It was sort of, remember those Freeberg and Seltzer movies where they would just reference things in pop culture as if that was funny? Yeah, that was like the original, saying, "Oh, it's Godzilla," in a racist, like Japanese, like broken English. Yeah, it was just, yeah, like as if that somehow was a joke somehow. I don't know. I don't get it. So I had this outside of that, I had this vague sense that Godzilla was this sort of fun, campy monster movie with a bunch of really colorful monster characters like Mothra, which I've heard of. I don't think I couldn't name any of the other Godzilla monsters off the top of my head. So I had this vague sense that Godzilla was this
70s
sort of
era where it became kind of like a superhero series.
Yeah, exactly. And so that was my vague sense of what Godzilla was, as I say, campy monsters and a guy in a suit. Watching this with that background in mind, I wasn't at all prepared to see a intelligent, serious satire, not haha satire, but the real sense of the word satire, with a message about nuclear war and damage to the planet and damage to populations and things like that. I absolutely was not prepared for the phenomenal cinematography. People look at Wizard of Oz and say, "Oh, I can't believe that was made." That looks like it was made in the 60s. This looks like it was made in the 60s. This does not look like it was made in 1954. And part of that might be too that the movies that I'm used to seeing that were made in the 50s were all just campy popcorn movies that were made for teenagers at that time. And so that's what I expect to see when I see something like that. And just the way that this was lit, and I'm going to use this term because I was in a live stream with somebody yesterday. I was talking about the fact that I had seen the movie, and he used this word. And so I wasn't going to do it because I didn't know if it was correct, but it definitely does feel like a noir in a lot of ways. And I fucking love me a noir.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, not that it's not a noir, but it looks like it in certain areas, which I really like.
Heavy.
Yeah, exactly. Just the shadows, the lighting, the camera angles, even it's funny too. The effects. I can tell that they're miniatures. They hadn't quite gotten in some places they did, but in a lot of places they hadn't quite figured out how to slow down.
They tumble a bit quicker, don't they, than what something of actual size would.
Yeah, exactly. So they hadn't worked out how to make the physics look correct, but apart from that, those miniatures were lit like it was a city. It looked that those effects, the perspectives that they used in that film were amazing for 1954. And I'm used to seeing miniatures and going, oh, they just kind of stuck something up. The airplanes looked, you could tell that they were on wires, but the camera was tracking as if it was trying to keep the way that a camera would behave if you were trying to keep an airplane in the frame. That was really good. That was a really good technique. I can't say enough about the cinematography and the effects.
There's also like the special effects of this movie. They're excellent, and we'll address Godzilla himself later down the line, but something I wanted to say about the effects is there are many shots in this movie where the background was a matte painting, and I defy you to tell me where it is.
Right.
Like,
well, there was
and it's just them. Sorry to cut you off. There's a shot that's just them on a hill talking, and you've got Japanese countryside in the background. And that Japanese countryside in the background was a fucking matte painting, and I didn't know that until today. And this is my favorite movie. I have seen this movie many times, and I did not know that it was a matte painting until literally today.
That was the scene where you first see the Godzilla creature, right?
Yes.
Yeah, that I can't believe. I thought that was a location. Holy cow, that's good. That's really good.
Me and my partner watched the original Universal Monsters Frankenstein earlier this week because we're going through all the Universal monster movies. Mm-hmm. I do respect that Godzilla was made 20 years later. But Godzilla was a low-budget movie for the time, and Frankenstein was not. This movie looks a fuck of a lot better than those Universal Monsters films. It looks way better. Like,
that's another thing that stood out to me is that I'm used to, when I see movies from this period or something around this period, I'm used to seeing a lot of the complete lack of stock footage was kind of shocking to me because those movies from that era like this contained a lot of stock footage, and there was, at least that I could see, there was no stock footage in this, and there was also no in the Universal movies or movies made in the 50s and stuff, you'll tend to see a lot of the same props used because studios would reuse props. Obviously, I didn't see any. Well, if the studio that made Godzilla did that, I wouldn't have been able to tell because I don't know Japanese media, so I wouldn't have seen it. So it was kind of like everything being original and made for this film was kind of surprising too.
To put it in perspective, there weren't films like Godzilla until after Godzilla. There was a film called The Beast of 20,000 Fathoms, which was an American film that was an influence for Godzilla. But as far as Japanese cinema is concerned, Godzilla really did create a genre, especially when it comes to the radioactive monster angle. I would say it's probably the most important piece of Japanese media ever made. It's certainly the most famous, but it is one of those films where, like last week we talked about Tron and how Tron did a lot of exciting things before any other movie did. This movie was literally genre defining, literally cinema defining, which is it's crazy. Like, the attention to detail is fantastic. This movie was directed by Ishiro Honda, and he directed movies until 1975, and he retired. And Akira Kurosawa, who is a legendary film director, reached out to Ishiro Honda, and he basically said, "It's a shame you're not still working on films. Would you like to be an assistant director on my films?" And Ishiro Honda did it. But something that Kurosawa noted about Ishiro Honda is they would use wooden sets and they would recreate wooden houses in a studio, and they would use cheap wood. And Ishiro Honda would go take a pen and he would draw the lines in the wood because they didn't show up on film, and he said it looked cheap, and he would draw in the texture onto the wood that they were using to give it the etchings that an actual wooden table, for example, would have.
Wow. That certainly shows up in the final in the final product. Obviously, we're going to talk about the monster and the creature design and the actual final like suit that they used, but nothing in the movie looked or came off as hokey the way that so many American films of that era do, to me anyway. And that was also a little jarring. I kept expecting that. It was in my muscle memory that you're going to see something hokey or silly. And as like, especially the line delivery. If I watch a movie that was made in the 50s or even the 60s, even Mad Mad World, some of the line delivery is like, it's just awkward because people don't talk like that anymore. But I don't understand Japanese, and I don't understand Japanese inflections or anything, so it was incapable of doing that. So it was interesting to see a movie from that era where the actors had a sort of an earnestness to them as opposed to just a hokiness.
Yeah, I think the performances are excellent.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they really were. There was one part where she breaks down crying, and it was a little not.
Yeah, and I think
great, but
I think that stood out. I think they actually jump cutted to the moment where she suddenly breaks down rather than doing it in one shot, which made it that's not the best. That's not a choice that I would have made. But
yeah, that was the only. But that's the only standout. Like that was the only thing like that in any way stands out. Everything else, well, the creature. Again, most of what I've seen of the Godzilla creature has been either parodies or clips of the campy movies that they made later. And I was not expecting this dark, incredibly well lit threatening creature to be.
Let's talk about Godzilla before we talk about the plot. Godzilla looks excellent in this film. He's looked Now, I have seen every Godzilla film. I love Godzilla the way that Trekkies love Star Trek. I've seen all of these movies way too many times, and let me tell you, Godzilla has looked rough. Godzilla has looked really rough. Some of those 70s movies, you can literally see the zipper, or you can see the costume actually breaking in the shot where they're using it, and you can see a piece of the costume come flying off. Godzilla has looked fucking rough. In this film, this original film that was not part of a media franchise, was not made as light, fun superhero entertainment like what later Godzilla films would be, where it's a bit more Power Rangers-y. Godzilla in this film looks fucking menacing. People would say that Godzilla didn't look as good as King Kong because King Kong was stop motion and Godzilla was in a suit. I think Godzilla looks better. They wanted to do stop motion, but they couldn't afford it. So they leaned into what they do in kabuki theater, the Japanese style of theater, with the use of puppetry and costume. They leaned into that and made Godzilla a man in a suit. And there is every fucking chance that this could go wrong. For example, look at any attempt to do this nation's version of Godzilla. If you see Gorgo, which was the British attempt at making a Godzilla film, looks like shit. Godzilla in this film looks excellent. He's always shot from low angles. It's always dark. There's fucking smoke everywhere. He looks brilliant. The only thing I could complain about is the hand puppet they used for some shots. Doesn't really work for me, but that's a shot here and there. Most of the time, Godzilla's just actually legitimately scary.
Well, you're completely bought into the atmosphere, too. I'm actually looking at footage of King Kong, and I gotta tell you, I don't think this aged well. And I think Godzilla looks as good today as it did. Well, it's going to, because it was lit and shot for real. Um, I don't agree that King Kong looked better. I'm looking at this, and this just looks like a video game running at a very, very low frame rate. It does. I don't think it aged very well. Although the rear screen projection is kind of impressive for the time. Yeah. But that was, I believe they used rear screen projection in the boat scene in Godzilla. If I'm not terribly mistaken, that was projection. Yeah, because that having the guy in the suit, I think was a better. I don't want to see stop motion Godzilla. Having the guy in the suit, that's a real creature that you can shoot and light, and that worked. And the forced perspectives that they used against him in the Tokyo scene, holy cow, that was, I said this to myself, and I think this is true. Philosophers often say that the history of Western philosophy is just a series of footnotes to Plato. I think that it's pretty clear, having seen this, that the history of disaster movies and monster movies is a series of footnotes to Godzilla. But even like I thought of Independence Day and all of the big like disaster movies that came out. Even Jurassic Park like clearly took a lot from this. This was such an impactful. You're right. It did create a genre that we still have to this day.
Yeah, absolutely. And what I think, you say you buy into the atmosphere, and I think that's because this movie does such a good job of setting Godzilla up. Because the plot of this film is very, very often misinterpreted by people who I don't think have actually seen the film. You very often hear that Godzilla was created by radiation. And
no, he was a dinosaur that got
and that is true in some Godzilla films. There's a lot of different continuities to Godzilla that we're not going to get into because we'll be here all day. But in some continuities, that is true. In the original movie, clearly something to do with radiation and nuclear bomb testing has altered Godzilla in some way, because he has an atomic heat beam that he fires out of his mouth, but he's more like a Lovecraftian entity.
I was gonna bring up Lovecraft. I was gonna bring that up. I was gonna say this is the only thing this reminds me of in terms of its lore. Sorry to cut you off, but it was Lovecraft. It was it was very, very. It was not very, but it was slightly Cthulhu-esque the way.
Godzilla in this movie is a monster that exists below the sea, and the inhabitants of the fictional Odo Island, which is supposed to be quite far from the Japanese mainland, have done sacrifices and rituals to this monster. But in modern day 1954 Japan, people don't tend to believe that Godzilla exists. The film never confirms if it is Godzilla. They say in the meetings that they're going to call it Godzilla in honor of the tradition, but they don't say that it is Godzilla. But they build you to it. At first, you just see and hear the wreckage that it causes. Then you see houses shaking and the looks of people when Godzilla first attacks. And then finally, when the characters go to Odo Island to investigate, then you see Godzilla, and it's the worst shot in the whole film. But after that, it looks excellent.
So, are you talking about the shot where he peeks out from behind the mountain and everybody screams?
So, not the first bit that you see, the bit where he leans over and he's facing the camera.
Right.
The bit where he's facing the camera, where that I don't think works, but it is what it is.
Yeah, sure. Every movie is going to have a hiccup here and there, but you're right that they say it's. By the way, let me ask you this. I watched the subtitled version. There was no dubbing, so the people were speaking Japanese. Um, and when they said when the name Godzilla would appear on the
Gojira.
screen, what's that?
Gojira.
Gojira. Is that what they were
Gojira.
saying?
Yeah, it's a.
Okay.
So they took the English word for gorilla and the Japanese word for whale, which is Ajira, and they made Gojira. That's what they're saying, but we've always anglicized it as Godzilla.
Godzilla.
So yeah,
so in Japan today, if they say there's a new Godzilla movie, they're gonna say it's Gojira. There's a new Gojira movie.
Yeah, it's Gojira.
Wow, that's tight. That sounds so much better.
Yeah. Mothra is Mosura.
That sounds way better.
Yeah.
Dang.
My pronunciation
I like
probably isn't great. I'm not Japanese, but yeah, Gojira.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I
like that you noticed that, by the way.
Yeah, I kept on waiting for them to say Godzilla, and I never heard it. I'm like, what are they saying? I could not make out what they were saying, because I noticed when they were testing for the radiation, it was like Japanese Geiger counter, and he said Geiger counter because that's
what it's called.
A Geiger counter is I would assume it was named after a dude named Geiger, so they just have to say it in the English pronunciation. But I kept on waiting for Godzilla, and I never heard it. Yeah, well, thank you for that. I was curious. Good. Yeah, so the misunderstanding of what the movie's about and the misunderstanding of the Godzilla's origin, that actually made me think of a lot of different things. I did think about Lovecraft, and I thought about the fact that the only fiction that we had in Western media where we were dealing with these big cosmic dealing with the unfathomable. Lovecraft dealt with the unfathomable. In fact, in a lot of his stories, people go insane when they get knowledge of how small we are in the universe and things. And that was something that I always loved about Lovecraft. And Japanese media seems to have been all about that for a very long time. They deal a lot with unfathomably large creatures, unfathomably powerful creatures.
Junji Ito comics, things like that.
Sure, exactly. And it was kind of surprising for me to see that in a 50s era film when I'm used to seeing hokey, we have to kill this creature. It's sort of like for the longest time, I thought of Dracula as this person who goes, and I want to suck your blood, and tries to suck people's blood. And reading the novel, I was surprised to experience this nice, elegant story about love and friendship that had very little to do with Dracula. Was just sort of the MacGuffin that brought everybody.
Is a calculating predator.
Yeah. Yes. He's trying to build a real estate empire in England and invade. I love his motivation. I fucking love that book, and I don't think any movie has ever gotten that exactly right. I wish one of them would, because it's such a great story. But in the same way, I always thought of Godzilla as this thing that sort of lumbers around and goes and breathes electricity or whatever. And I was kind of surprised to see a nice, elegant story about responsibility and friendship and stuff that had but a living nightmare. Yes, absolutely, something that was actually menacing. But also, I was surprised at how little Godzilla was in it.
Yes,
and how little Godzilla in and of himself, because the threat that they were talking about, that the scientists, and forgive me, I'm bad with names, and I'm even worse
Dr.
with names that I can't pronounce. Dr. Zarazawa, yeah, when they were talking about what they needed to stop, they didn't need to stop Godzilla. They needed to stop the thing that made Godzilla that forced him to act the way he was acting. But for the fact that they were doing the nuclear testing, he would have been just living under the water.
Yeah, because he's been
going
down there
about
for
his
God
business.
knows how long.
For million. By the way, the Jurassic period was not 2 million years
I
ago.
know, the
it was about
paleontology
200 million years.
Awful.
Yeah, it's
fucking awful.
Yeah, it was. But yeah. Yeah,
Well,
no, it was
things
hundreds of millions.
there's a lot of films that came out after Godzilla that I'm not talking about movies like Them or The Giant Gila Monster or movies like that. Like, I'm not talking about those monster movies, but serious movies about nuclear Armageddon, what I call nuclear misery porn, like Threads, The Day After, When the Wind Blows, On the Beach.
Yeah.
And I think about how Godzilla was 9 years removed from the actual bombs.
Oh fuck, dude! I have to say something about that. There was a lot. Yeah, okay. You may find this interesting. The girl on the train. She said, "I just survived the bombing of Nagasaki, and now this." And in that moment, it hit me. That was less than a decade earlier for that actress. That happened less than a decade earlier. That happened in my life. That would have been when my son was born.
Yep.
It was like the recent event that hadn't been resolved yet. And from my perspective, I actually messaged one of my other friends about this, and I said, it's interesting that from Andrew's perspective, he doesn't have to sit here and on some level go, "Fuck, that was us. We did that," as part of your collective conscience.
I understand what you mean.
Yeah,
well,
and it's so from.
Sorry, no, I was going to say, like, the fact that it's 9 years removed from the actual bombs, and the fact that it uses essentially a metaphor rather than going, "This is what the nukes will do." It uses metaphor because remember, this film, 9 years removed from the actual bombs, shows the capital of Japan. What would, if it wasn't at the time, what would become the largest city in the world on fire, destroyed. This film was controversial when it came out.
Yeah, no, we talked about Cloverfield in the context of 9/11. I gave you my experience of having recently at that time experienced 9/11, and I watched I looked at Tokyo in flames in that movie, and I went, fuck, people watching this movie might have been there. People watching this movie may have seen that. How would people in 1954 in Japan have reacted to this? That was balls, dude. This movie had fucking balls for that. And holy shit.
Yeah, I mean, let's talk about the plot of the movie. And someone who hasn't seen this film, this is your exit point, even though we've probably spoiled some of it. But the film starts with a series of boats, like fishing boats, because of the inspiration that I talked about in the intro being destroyed. And the investigation leads them to basically be forced to reconcile with the fact that there is an ancient, incomprehensibly large monster living in the ocean, and America's nuclear bomb testings have woke it up, and it's pissed. What does it want? We never find out. We don't really know. It might not want anything. It's just this rampaging force of nature. This film doesn't have a main character. This film is less about character and character arcs and more about the situation and the conflicts and ideas that arise from the situation. Because when you mentioned that woman who has just survived one of the atomic bombs, she just appears in like a vignette. You just see little moments of people's lives where, like, you see the child who's being looked over with the Geiger counter, and the doctor basically gives a look like, this kid's not going to make it. You see parents, like mother, like cradling her children, saying, "We'll be with daddy soon." Obviously, the implication that their dad had died. Children crying as their mortally wounded mums are being taken away from them. You just see these little moments of the people of Japan and how they exist before and during this disaster. And then our four main characters, I'd say, were Ogata, who works for the Coast Guard, and he's a diver, and he is important because he's going to be the one who goes down in the ocean at the end. You've got the professor, who is the guy who gives you all the exposition, and he explores the thematic idea of, well, do we destroy it or do we study it? Because Godzilla is immune to radiation. And then, of course, you have Dr. Serizawa, who we'll get to, and then you have Emiko, who is kind of the glue that binds them all together, and is more the story's heart, and more who I would say who pushes a lot of the plot along of getting certain characters to agree with certain things. But we'll go to Dr. Serizawa, because ultimately I would say the plot revolves around him. The first time he appears is when they go to sail off to Odo Island, and the characters are like, shit, Dr. Serizawa has left his lab to see us off. He never leaves his lab. That's kind of a bad omen. You're immediately like, there is something off with this dude. They mention that he lost his eye in World War II, although we don't know what did it. And he takes the lady into his lab, and he shows her her new invention. And we don't see what it does. We only see her scream, and then we see her leave. And as the film progresses, eventually we learn that he has created a device that destroys the oxygen in the ocean, and when he puts it in water, it kills everything in the water, and then it dissolves the particles, and there is nothing left. He has created the weapon of mass destruction. He's like our Oppenheimer, stand-in Oppenheimer, who created the atomic bomb. And he himself goes, I didn't try to make a weapon. I was doing experiments with oxygen, and I found this. And the climax of the story, because there's not a lot of plot to this film, it's mostly a feeling. The climax of this movie is a fucking debate. It's not, now we're going to go and shoot Godzilla with rockets like what it is in the 98 American remake. It's not, now Godzilla's going to fight another monster. The climax of this film is a debate, and that debate is, should this weapon be used against Godzilla? Because then people will know that this weapon exists. And they go to him, burn your notes, just destroy all of your notes. And he goes, but it's in my head. And they're like, well, don't tell anyone. And he goes, I'm a human, and humans are weak. I could be coerced. As long as I'm alive, the oxygen destroyer is alive. And I really want your thoughts on this, because this, I think, is maybe, I think this scene, this debate, which does serve as the ending of our film, is, I think, what the film ultimately is about. And the reason Dr. Serizawa changes his mind is when, on the radio, the song of that choir, as they're essentially praying through song for anything to save them in the wake of this disaster, he hears that and he's like, fuck, I guess I gotta do it.
Yeah.
And he uses it, he destroys Godzilla, and he kills himself, and he dies with Godzilla so that the secret remains. And of course the film does end on a warning, which is, if these weapons keep being used and keep being tested, there will be another Godzilla. There was one.
Yeah.
But I really want your thoughts on that, because I think the fact that this film's climax, the real climax of the film, because Godzilla being destroyed, that's just the resolution. There's no like epic scene at the end. The climax of the film is, we need you to just fucking do what needs to be done. And I would just want to know what your thoughts on it are.
I was gonna bring up Oppenheimer too. Damn, you beat me to it. Now people are gonna think I just copied you. So I was so, especially during the Tokyo scenes and the hospital scenes and the scenes with people dying with children. One of the things that I learned when we learned about those terrible events was that there is in some museum somewhere a tricycle that they found in the wreckage of pretty sure it was Nagasaki. And what we know about it is that it was a birthday gift that a little girl got for her birthday that day. Her birthday was that day, and she was vaporized or some such. And I never forgot that. It's kind of seared into my heart, kind of. And so when I saw a lot of those scenes, I kept thinking about that. And there was,
because you see people get vaporized in this film.
Mm-hmm.
You see Godzilla, like, because when Godzilla blasts the heat beam, we all know Godzilla does it now because cultural osmosis. But in the context of that film, it was a twist. It was, oh god, it gets worse. But yeah, sorry, continue.
Yeah, it's just so what I think what I'm getting at here is that in so much of these disaster movies and monster movies that are made in the West and especially in America, one of the things that I like in this too, when I thought about the Tokyo scene and how close in time that was to an actual event that looked like that people may have seen or experienced, was the Steven Spielberg War of the Worlds, where Tom Cruise goes home and he's shaking the dust out of his hair, and that's people, and that actually happened to people. So I sort of, one of the things that I was sort of semi-conscious of when I was watching Godzilla is I'm used to the victims of the disaster being us. And in this movie, the allegory for the disaster is us. And that was really jarring to me. And it was strange for the sort of self-sympathy that we see in so many of these disaster movies being absent or applying to a different people. And I had a little bit of trouble because my instinct is to say this is about how something terrible happened to us and we need to go join the military or something. Because that instinct is there, I kept on losing focus of what Godzilla was an allegory for. So a lot of so it was hard for me to at the end, it was hard for me to immediately identify what the debate was, because in my mind I was going, shit, this isn't about how our scientists are making dinosaurs and we shouldn't do that, or about how our society was attacked and we should go to war with other countries because of it. This is about us doing something to somebody else and their reaction to it. So on that note, you tell me, what was your view of that part at the end?
I think the film's a middle finger.
Mm-hmm.
That's how I feel. What I think, because for me, those scenes at the end, the actor who plays Dr. Sawa, Akihiko Hirata, he was in a lot of Godzilla movies and he played a lot of different characters, and it's very hard to tell when it's him a lot of the time, but he did quite a few of these different characters each time. His performance is so agonizing. It's not hokey or old-timey, it's so agonizing and just brutally honest. And for me, it was that idea that the oxygen destroyer is as much a metaphor for nuclear bombs as Godzilla is, because Godzilla is, I think, a metaphor for nuclear bombs, nuclear destruction as we understand it, because you got to keep in mind as well that until the Lucky Dragon 5 was irradiated in that incident that I spoke about at the beginning, people were more concerned about the immediate destruction that the bombs could do, and they weren't as concerned with fallout because it wasn't really understood as such. And Castle Bravo changed that. Godzilla is this metaphor for not just nuclear destruction, but the fallout that comes with it. Like, people get sick from Godzilla being there. Whereas the Oxygen Destroyer, I think, and obviously Dr. Serizawa as a character is more like that Oppenheimer stand-in. The potential that, yes, we've got nuclear weapons in this world. Do I bring in something that could be worse? Because, and here's a doomer moment for you, the nuclear weapons, probably not what we should be that worried about. There are chemical weapons, there's anthrax, there's all sorts of horrible shit that can potentially be used. And he goes, do I add to the pile? Do I bring another terrible creation into this world? How do I stop it? Dr. Serizawa in the movie chooses to take his own life to make sure that the monster that he has created dies with him and Godzilla. In real life, Dr. Oppenheimer, he lived the rest of his life.
Rather comfortably.
Yeah, and I'm not in no way saying that he should have done what Dr. Serizawa did. I'm not saying anything like that. But in real life, the consequences of his actions were not that he was punished, but that he had to live with it. And it's very difficult because you are talking about the experience of people that you've never met, and something that you cannot relate to. Unless you were there, I don't think anyone truly understands. I know that there have been terror incidents like 9/11. I know that there have been terror incidents like 7/7 in Britain, things that did... Well, 7/7 kind of didn't really scare anyone, but that's because Britain's used to terror attacks.
Also, the bombing of London, I think, would also... Or Dresden, and
Yeah, like there's... But the scale of the nuclear bombs, and keep in mind, nuclear bombs weren't even the most of it. The fire bombings did a lot more damage and killed a lot more people. It's this mind-boggling thing, and this is kind of a ramble, but what I think Godzilla does so well is it captures a feeling. It doesn't do this fucking character arc nonsense of like, well, this character, through their experiences in this horrible situation, learns something about themselves. It's not like that. It's not Titanic. It's not Titanic, where Titanic is a disaster, but the moral of Titanic is love is love, and don't be shackled to tradition. It's not like Titanic. It's a film about an event, and the characters are all related to the event, and it's a film that carries such a feeling with it. The film is miserable, and people people, because I don't think many people have seen this film so much as they've seen its successors. The film's miserable.
It made me think of the Day After. Actually, I would be shocked if a lot of the scenes in the Day After weren't inspired by, especially the hospital scene. There's a very similar hospital scene in the Day After that I'm pretty sure was inspired by that one.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't be shocked if there was influence, at least through just cultural osmosis, because Godzilla, I think, is the most notable example of a film like this, but also ultimately they're all influenced by the real event. And I think that what is so fascinating about Godzilla as the origin of how it's made is much like the recent, I would call a remake that Japan did called Shin Godzilla, that was influenced by the Fukushima power plant accident, and the Japanese government's complete failure to appropriately deal with it spawned another Godzilla movie. What a surprise. This wasn't actually egged on by the nuclear bombs. It was the continued testing. And I think that because Godzilla is not just a metaphor for nuclear destruction, it's the potential. This film, it ends with a warning, there will be another. And there was.
Yeah. Yeah. No, you're absolutely right. And that stood out to me too, that it was the continued testing of it. And also that in worse hands, and I want to be very clear, I wouldn't have been bothered if they had done this, but in worse hands, this could have been a movie that was sort of where the villain would have been the American military.
No, they're not even mentioned.
Having it be no, not at all. Having that be an allegory and a satire was so much more effective and so much more intelligent. I was, I'll maybe leave my thoughts here. I was surprised at how intelligent a film this was, considering how most of what everybody has seen, including myself, has been sort of the campy, suit where you can see the zipper, as you mentioned, and all that. I was really surprised at how intelligent a movie this was.
Yeah, I love those campy schlocky B movies.
Sure,
I do. Sure. But this film to me, there is what I would call a trilogy of what I call the serious Godzilla movies. The Heisei era, which was a reboot series that only considered the first Godzilla movie canon, took itself quite seriously, but it was a pulpy sci-fi kind of take itself seriously. It wasn't in that it wasn't going for comedy. But the big three that I would say of these serious Godzilla movies are, incidentally, all the ones where he doesn't fight another monster. You have this one, you have Return of Godzilla, which was the 1984 direct sequel to this one that ignored everything but this one, that dealt with the Cold War tensions really rising. Because I think the original Godzilla is maybe the first great movie of the Cold War, for however you want to take that.
And that's a really good point. Yeah.
And then you have Shin Godzilla, which came out in 2016, directed by Hideaki Anno, who did Neon Genesis Evangelion, and that was essentially a political thriller and a satire again of politicians sitting in offices trying to figure out what to do about Godzilla, but they're all too fucking caught up in their bureaucracy to get anything properly done, inspired by the Fukushima power plant meltdown. But I think that's like the trilogy of serious politically minded Godzilla movies. The Shin Godzilla, which maybe we should talk about one day, one of the last lines of that film. This film ended with "There will be another," and the most recent live-action Godzilla film that's not an American like Kong versus Godzilla kind of thing, not a MonsterVerse film. It has a line near the end: "We're going to have to learn to live with Godzilla." And I think that they make for fascinating bookends of where not just Japan, but where we all are when it comes to nuclear power, something that can be harnessed for good, but something that is undeniably very dangerous. And I think obviously what with the tension that initially came with the war in Ukraine, where I think before the war in Ukraine at the time of recording this has been going for about a year, but there was, I think, some genuine fear that it could result in nuclear weapons being used in some form. And I think
No,
there
definitely.
was, and hopefully you're reading this, listening to this in the future, and that war is over and it never happened. But there was a fear that that would happen, and I hope that I am not made a fool of when I say it didn't happen. At least not so far. But I think Godzilla has always worked as this fascinating parable, basically. Not just for Japan, but for all of us now, because we live in a nuclear age, and we are, whether we like it or not, it's not going anywhere. And Godzilla hasn't gone anywhere. Godzilla is fast approaching its 70th anniversary. This film is 68 years old. It's nukes aren't going anywhere. Godzilla's not going anywhere.
And if we do have that new threat of nuclear war with with the Russian situation, and China is there's a lot of global tensions again. We do find ourselves right back where we were during the Cold War era, with nuclear war as a real threat in the world again. We also have the fact that nuclear power can be a solution to a lot of the environmental problems that we have in the world. So yeah, it's very that the peaceful use versus threat of nuclear annihilation is a real dichotomy again. And yeah, this was an excellent look at just that.
To wrap this up, what did you think of Godzilla now that you've been around 42 years and you finally saw it?
Yep, that's right. Absolutely. I thought it was phenomenal. I thought it's the best looking film of its decade that I've ever seen. It's the best use of costumes and miniatures of that era by far that I've ever seen, in force perspectives. And I could just list any technique of filmmaking and it would be probably the best example of its era that I've seen. And the story was smart and thought-provoking and not hokey and not campy, and is very as relevant even today, as we just said. So yeah, I thought it was phenomenal.
I think my closing thoughts on it are kind of to give you a little bit of where I am with Godzilla as a series. Godzilla is a series that even when they make some crap, I can always let it slide. I'm way softer with this series than I am with other movie series. I grew up loving dinosaurs, and I still love dinosaurs. So of course, Godzilla ended up being something that was either given to me in VHS tapes, like videotapes, or being recorded off the TV when they are on. And the truth is, Godzilla is a part of my life to the point where I do not remember a point in my life where I was not aware of Godzilla. I do not remember that point. As far as I know, I've been watching these films since I was a baby. I think I might have been about 8 when I saw this film. I had seen, it wasn't the first Godzilla film I'd seen. I couldn't tell you what the first one I saw was because I've been watching them for so long. I don't know which the first I saw was. But I think I saw this one when I was about 8. And even at that age, when it's not as exciting as watching Godzilla kick the shit out of Megalon or something like that, it stuck with me. And it was one of the first times that I remember watching a movie that was subtitled. And I think this film, and you could say it's a flawed way to learn, but I think this film is how I really became aware of nuclear weapons and what happened to Japan. And to a degree, maybe I was too young to know, but I saw this film from an early age and it was formative to me. I often say this is my favourite film ever. And the truth is how true that is, I couldn't tell you. I get choked up at the end of E.T. every time I see it. I have such a funny, like a fun high from watching Back to the Future or Jurassic Park. Films that I revisit more often than I revisit Godzilla. But this film just stuck with me when I saw it at 8 years old, and I've never been able to shake it. And it didn't scar me for life, you know. It didn't ruin my childhood or anything, but it stuck with me. And that was why I wanted to start our technically our third, but like our second full year of doing movie night with a film that was quite special to me. I spent a long time wanting to talk about this and then putting it off, and then say doing something else, suggesting another film, because I didn't know how I could ever put into words how the film made me feel. And I still don't think I've done it, but I felt like I had to talk about it finally, because this film to me is something very, very special. This film is something to me that, like, when it's what I want from a film. I want something that makes me feel something, and for whatever detractors of this film might say, for me this is my favorite movie ever made. But yeah, that's my closing thoughts on Gojira.
Gojira, I'm glad you told me about that, and I genuinely thank you for sharing that with me. Whenever we get to Blade Runner, I'll be in the same headspace, believe me.
That'll be a good one.
Yeah, absolutely. And as far as favorite films goes, I feel, having seen it now, you couldn't have picked a better one.